don't have any control over what happens ultimately. You know, that is in God's hands. The only thing I control is this little piece of real estate inside my own shoes. There's a couple of things that every demagogue can use to manipulate people, and one of those is fear, because it disables our capacity for critical thinking. There's a 2013 poll that showed that 85% of Americans under 35 said they were proud of the United States of America. Same poll taken last month showed only 18%. My initial bias about psychedelic drugs is again colored by my experience of being in recovery for 40 years. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, I am never gonna do that again. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd be doing exactly what I said. And you know, it was like somebody else had stepped into my body and was now, you know, a new driver in the truck. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay its production costs. We have to be able to weather those difficulties without being crushed in our soul, or without being ultimately affected by it. And that's kind of the objective where we all want to be spiritually, where we're indifferent to the personal consequences of everything that we do, and that we live our lives for higher purposes.
The vast majority of people in the audience are entrepreneurs, capitalists. Love to get your views on the environment and capitalism, because that's a topic that there's a lot of debate on.
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the reception. I've been working as an environmental advocate and attorney for 40 years, for my entire career, but I started out as an attorney for commercial fishermen on the Hudson River. And we built that organization. They launched a patrol boat. These were people who were capitalists. They were small business people, and they saw their livelihoods being destroyed by pollution on the river. And these were people who, the Hudson River commercial fishery is the oldest in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent came from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, and then passed down through the generations. And there was nothing wrong with their business model. But the General Electric Company used political clout in Albany to get permission to illegally dump PCBs into the river, rather than properly disposing them. And it saved them money. It allowed them to outcompete the other producers of capacitors and to win in the marketplace, but they had distorted the market signals by cheating the market. And these fishermen knew that their problem was not their business model. It was that we didn't have free market capitalism on the river. We had a kind of corporate crony capitalism that was allowing polluters to use political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. One of the things I learned very early on was that we don't have to choose between good environmental policy and good economic policy. In 100% of the cases, good economic policy is identical to good environmental policy. If we want to measure the economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters often want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time, and they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And You know, my approach has always been colored by my experience. I worked for 40 years for the commercial fishermen, and that really kind of colored my worldview about the environment. And if you can go back 35 or 40 years ago and look at speeches that I was giving back then where people would ask me, what's the most important solution, most effective solution to environmental pollution? And I always said the same thing, it's free market, true free market capitalism. Because a true free market promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste. And pollution is waste. And a true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully or recklessly. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for the rest of us, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay its production costs. And what I did as an environmental advocate, I really always considered myself a free marketeer, that I was going out into the marketplace to catch the cheaters and to bring them to court and say to them, we're gonna force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody can externalize those costs, it distorts the marketplace. And none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that true free market capitalism offers our country.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me ask my team, make sure we put a timer up here so we know the time if we could, because it's not on. Thank you. So I asked the audience to submit some questions, and I can't ask all of them, but one of them was about psychedelics. And let me preface this by saying, you know that I've been in recovery, you've been in recovery for 40 years, and I'm the first person in the world to have before and after brain scans doing ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT, which I did in 2015 in Mexico, and we took a film crew and we filmed it, and then we did interviews with the doctor that did the before and after brain scans and whatnot. And I've seen miraculous things happen, but I'm also worried about the pharmaceutical industries, like they're doing with everything, co-opting it. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on psychedelics? Because my viewpoint on it is in the field of recovery, depression, mental illness, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, my initial bias about psychedelic drugs is again colored by my experience of being in recovery for 40 years and having I go to like 9 meetings a week. So 12-step meetings. I've heard a lot of bad stories about people, you know, involvement with drugs and alcohol and pharmaceutical drugs. So my bias is that I don't think that in most cases that we can fix things that are wrong inside of us with things that are outside of us. With, you know, all the things that we reach for when we feel discomfort, whether it's drugs or alcohol or sex or reckless behavior. And we're particularly people who are prone to addiction are always looking for things outside of them to fix this, you know, to fill this empty hole that they have inside of them. Having said that, I have 7 kids, and my wife in 2012 took her own life and left me with 6 children. And so all of those kids were at risk at that time. And they all ended up doing really wonderful things with their lives, and they're in good relationships, and they're, you know, outside now of that what I would call a risk bubble. One of them was worrying to me because he never processed his mom's death in a way that I could observe. He seemed like a happy kid. He was always smiling. He did get in a lot of fist fights, and he was he became a boxer, and he won a lot of tournaments, and then he became a hockey player. But everything he did, there was a little bit of violence too, and it made me worried about him. And he went to about 5 years ago. He was very self-contained. He never talked about what was going on inside of him. And he went to Patagonia to kayak a whitewater river that I kayaked for many, many years, every year, called the Futaleufú. And he went down there to do it with a friend, and he had a 5-day wait between the time that his kayak trip was going to start and the time that he arrived there. And I had a friend who I knew a little bit, just an acquaintance down there who had some land property down there. And I asked this guy to put my son up for a couple of days while he was waiting for his trip to start. And that guy, the night my son arrived there, that guy said to him, "I'm doing an ayahuasca trip tonight." And he said, "God sent you boys to me," because he was doing it with 20 Puente Indians. And he said, "I was praying to God that he would send me a gringo to do this with." And so my kid ended up doing this. And he had this experience where after he drank the ayahuasca, they gave them all a bucket and they gave him a sleeping bag, and it was kind of in an outdoor place with a fire. And after he drank it, he felt himself sinking through all the geological strata of the earth. And he could look at all of it. He told me he could look at all the folds of stone and geology. And he had a total understanding of all of the processes that had laid them out for the eons. He ended up being propelled out of the other side of the earth and then floating through space for what he experienced as hundreds of years. And he would focus on a distant planet and be transported there. And on each planet, he would have an adventure. At the end of the adventure, there would be a lesson, a moral lesson that he would learn, that he was supposed to remember. The last planet he visited, his mother was there. And she started passing through him, in and out of him again and again. And every time she did that, he felt all these experiences of forgiveness, of love, of understanding, of comprehension, of empathy and compassion. And when he came back from that trip, he was completely changed. He was very open about talking about his feelings. He was on a real spiritual quest. He was very, very openly just happy all the time. And the reason I really know that it changed him is he started taking out the garbage and doing the dishes. And he's done the dishes constantly without ever being asked since then. He's a 24-year-old kid. So you know that's a miracle. That opened my mind to the possibility that there may be, something that I didn't understand or that was outside of my kind of bubble of prejudices. And then I have a friend who's a Navy SEAL who had severe PTSD, and he went to Costa Rica and had the same kind of experience. And I had a couple of other friends who are in the NFL, and they also had severe brain injuries and depression, terrible, terrible depression. And the same thing happened. And then I looked at Michael Pollan's documentary, which I think is on Netflix.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there's one particularly poignant story. He goes through each of the psychedelics, a show for each one. And I think the third show was on psilocybin. And there's a kid on that show who had severe OCD. He literally could not go out of his house. He had to do all of these rituals, he had to constantly clean his hands. He had to walk through the door 10 times or 20 times or 60 times. And he had to do all these very repetitive rituals, and it absolutely paralyzed him. and destroyed his life. And he did one psilocybin trip, and it was completely gone. So, my mind is open to the idea that, there may be things that I don't know about, and that people ought to have the freedom and the liberty to experiment with these things. I like what you said at the outset, which is, we know the capacity of the pharmaceutical industry to come and capture this if they see that there's money in it, and then to turn it into something very, very bad, and to promote it in ways that it shouldn't be promoted. So, my inclination, and I haven't thought this through that much, but my inclination would be to make this available at least in therapeutic settings and maybe more generally, but in ways that would discourage the corporate control and exploitation of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, we could, I believe that addiction is a solution to pain, and addiction works if you're lonely, depressed, anxiety-ridden in the moment, but the problem is it has this thing called consequences that can destroy your life and make your life not work. And I think we live in a culture that we have the largest addiction crisis in human history right now. There's a lot of temptation, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma. I think the last 3 to 4 years of the pandemic has created more angst, more pain, more trauma that will last literally generations, and I think millions of lives have been destroyed as a result of it, and one of the coping mechanisms is addiction, and I think anything that could help with that, and I think psychedelics are one part of that, is beneficial. If you become president, what could you do or will you do to fix this issue?
Yeah, I mean, part of the, addiction, like you say, it's a response to internal pain. It's also a response to atomization, to loneliness, to disconnection, to disaffection. And we're seeing that's now epidemic in this country, where so many of us feel that we're no longer connected to a community. There was a poll recently that showed that, there was a 2013 poll that showed that, that when asked, 85% of kids, of Americans under 35 said they were proud of the United States of America. The same poll taken last month showed only 18%.
Wow.
So they've lost faith in our country, they've lost hope for their own future, they've lost a connection to community. And now, we're seeing the biggest cause of suicide among black youth today, of death among black youth is suicide. We lost 106,000 kids last year to fentanyl overdose or to other opioid overdoses. That's double the number of kids that we lost in the 20-year Vietnam War. We're really in a crisis now. One of my kind of moonshot program or Peace Corps program, to use metaphors from my uncle's administration, will be to start to launch a string of healing centers around this country, particularly in rural areas where people will go there and do regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, grow good food, healthy food, and learn to live in communities again without screens, without cell phones. And I've looked at these places for 40 years. The rehab industry in this country is, I would say, somewhat predatory at this point, like many, many other industries. But I had a relative who was in a lot of trouble, and I started looking all over the world for places that had a different model. And I found this place in Italy, in Tuscany, called San Patrignano, and it's a 500-acre farm. There's 2,000 kids who live there. It's absolutely free. The only thing they ask you to commit to is to stay there for 5 years. When you go there,
5 years?
Listen, if it's a choice, a lot of kids today are on a trajectory where they're going to die. And, 5 years is like college. And if you can save somebody's life, it takes time because you have to reparent the person. You have to reorient them to live in a completely different way. And, they're taking people who are criminals, who are not only drug addicts, but people who are, headed for prison, headed for something very bad. They take them and they transform them into good citizens. So at that place, it's completely self-supporting. In Italy, you can do a checkoff on your taxes to send $1, approximately $1 on your taxes. There's a little checkoff to San Patrignano. Most of their money comes from their industry, so they have one of the best bakeries in Europe, and they teach kids traditional baking skills. They have an apparel center where they do weaving, and they make accessories, fashion accessories. So they make purses for Della Valle, for Prada, for Gucci, for these other big brands. They have a vineyard, 500-acre vineyard, and they make some of the finest wine in Europe. They have kennels, and they have a wallpaper factory that makes this hand-painted wallpaper, very, very traditional, with traditional artisans. There's no cell phones allowed, there's no screens, and the people live together in very, very tight kind of barracks. There's 6 girls, and my relative was a girl, and she was put in with 6 girls who watched her every move. And if she did something selfish, if she did something dishonest, she was called on it. And it taught her a new way of living in a community. And when she came out, she became very, very successful. And not only in her business life, but also her social life, she was utterly transformed. 2 days ago, I went to a place in Salt Lake City called The Other Side that is modeled on San Patrignano. And they have now 3 city blocks full of buildings. They have 300 convicts. They take people out of prison, or they take people who are facing long sentences, and they interview them to see if they're suitable for the program. They bring them into that program, and they rehabilitate them. And they have to make a 2-year commitment. It's absolutely free. Anybody can walk in the street and take advantage of it. They have the biggest moving company in Salt Lake. They have the biggest storage company in Salt Lake. They have a thrift store that is the size of 2 Walmarts. They have a construction firm that is very, very successful, and they teach the inmates how to be electricians, how to be plumbers, all of these skills that they can use in the world. And the guy who started it was facing his 5th term in prison. He was facing a 29-year prison sentence. And he persuaded the judge to allow him to go to Delancey Street, which is a therapeutic community in San Francisco. And he ended up working there for 8 years and then coming out and starting this place. And it was so inspiring going to this place and to The Other Side and seeing what they'd done, because it's a model that can be reproduced elsewhere. And instead of, when I was in prison for the summer of 2001, I was sent to, I won a lawsuit against the Navy in Puerto Rico for bombing the island of Vieques. And I did it, the judge, there was a corrupt judge who would not enforce my injunction. And so the group, I was representing 10,000 people on the island, and they asked me to do a civil disobedience to go onto the live fire zone while the Navy was bombing, and I was arrested. They told me, I said, how long am I gonna be in jail? And they said, well, just probably a day. But I ended up being the whole summer in maximum security prison. And my youngest son was born while I was in prison. The first time I saw him was on Visitor's Day. But in that prison, which is a federal prison, much better than state prison, I couldn't even go to an AA meeting. there was no opportunities for any of the people who were living there to make their lives better. And we need to do that better. We need to make sure when people come out of prison, they're actually productive. So the guy who was running this said to me that when he first started trying to place the convicts in businesses in Salt Lake, that nobody wanted them because they're ex-cons. But now they have such a good work record and such a good reputation that he has a list of hundreds and hundreds of businesses on the wall and they employ 100% of the people who leave, and everybody in Salt Lake wants people from this program because they're such responsible workers. Oh, it was inspiring to me to see that, the transfer of what I saw in San Patrignano happen in this country. Today, the biggest industry in rural areas in our country are prisons. And I want to change that and make rehab and restoration of the feeling of community in this country, the skills of living in a community, to reparent all of these kids who are lost today, an entire generation of kids who are lost. Give them the opportunity to go to places where they can learn to be productive members of society and where they can get inspired again about their lives and regain hope in their lives.
I love that. I love that. It's great. So you probably met him backstage. I don't know if he's out here, but we have Andre Norman who's here, who spent 14 years in maximum security prison, and he became the #3 gang leader. He spent 2 years in solitary confinement, and now this guy's like an absolute angel and just helped so many people. And he's in charge of a program which currently has 600,000 tablets in prisons in the United States, soon to be 1 million. And we have Genius Network content, we have Genius Recovery content from my foundation on those tablets. 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States, so we're the highest incarcerating country in the world. I believe it's between 80 to 90% of everyone that's arrested or thrown in jail or prison. Drugs and alcohol were involved. 40% of people that are incarcerated committed a violent crime, so that's a separate issue, but 60% had